Chapter 1. May Love Find Us. St. Patrick, A.D. 387 to 461. Ireland. You hold it all together. You hold it all together, all sons and daughters. As we flew over the Atlantic Ocean toward Dublin, Ireland, Ashton and I shifted uncomfortably in our seats, trying to get some much-needed shut-eye. It was my daughter's 16th birthday and also marked day one of her rite of passage experience. I finally dozed off 2 hours before we were scheduled to land, but was abruptly awakened when Ashton jerked violently next to me. To my horror, she looked as white as a ghost, her eyelids fluttering about wildly. She was fading in and out of consciousness. Panicked, I grabbed her face and shouted, "Ashton! Ashton, wake up! Look at me!" No response. Only grunting sounds emanated from her throat. Unsure of what to do, I pushed the service call button, and a flight attendant came quickly to our seats. My daughter is on the verge of passing out," I exclaimed. "Can you help me?" Springing into action, the concerned attendant helped me get Ashton out of her seat and into the service area at the center of the plane. We laid her down and propped up her legs while another helpful flight attendant placed an oxygen mask over Ashton's face. A few minutes later, a young man walked up and introduced himself as a doctor. "Something is seriously wrong with my daughter," I blurted out. He offered to help and began rattling off a series of questions. Taking Ashton's blood pressure, which was unusually low, he asked how much water she'd had that day. I wasn't sure. Then it hit me. In a show of solidarity, and because at the ripe old age of 45 I knew it would be good for me, Ashton and I had engaged in a hardcore exercise and nutrition plan before our trip. We celebrated her birthday and the end of our restricted eating by spending the day at the pool and indulging in cake and ice cream. After 21 days of drinking half our body's weight in water, this was the first day we had ignored our disciplines. I figured Ashton had consumed a glass of water at most, and relayed this to the doc. Dr. John nodded confidently, concluding that she was dehydrated. He explained that being on an airplane accentuates the symptoms of dehydration, causing blood pressure to drop and potentially resulting in a loss of consciousness. For the next 2 hours, Dr. John, my new favorite person on the planet, and I closely monitored a fatigued Ashton while she sipped juice and water. Toward the end of our flight, she seemed to be getting better. When the wheels touched down, and after lavishing gratitude on the good doctor and the Irish flight attendants, my daughter and I walked off the plane to a waiting wheelchair on the jetway. There, a cheery young Irish woman accompanied us on our passage through customs. While our final destination was London, where we had arranged to meet the band and our production team, the 9-hour layover in Dublin afforded Ashton and me some time to explore the city. To my relief, by this time, Ashton was now mostly revived. Sitting on a bus as it lurched through the streets of the Irish capital, I turned to my daughter and let out a sigh. "Wow," I said, smiling. "I wanted your rite of passage to be difficult, but I wasn't expecting it to start quite this way." The birth of Christianity. After scarfing down replenishing burgers and chips at Bobo's, a favorite local eatery, and with plenty of time to visit a couple of the historic sites in Dublin, Ashton and I headed toward the first destination on our list, St. Patrick's Cathedral. I had recently become fascinated with St. Patrick and was looking forward to exploring the grand cathedral that bears his name. Though Patrick is one of the more popular Catholic saints and has been a color-themed holiday in his honor in the United States, many Americans have little idea how his life influenced the spiritual trajectory of the world. To understand Patrick's story, it's helpful to know the backdrop. Around AD 33 through 35, the explosive beginnings of Christianity occurred at the cross-section of 3 dominant cultures, Hebrew, Greek, and Roman. Emboldened by the resurrection, Jesus' early disciples began teaching and preaching the gospel, the dynamic, mind-blowing news that God loved the human race so much that he offered a sacrifice, his only child, to redeem the world. Like a lamb to the slaughter, this Son of God died for the sins of humankind, and 3 days later came back to life. World religion at the time was full of myths and parables, but this was the first God to visit the planet as a human and then die on behalf of its people, his creation. This news spread like wildfire. The world was being introduced to a kind, just, and trustworthy God who clothed himself in flesh and walked among us. And by the thousands, people believed. As the first few centuries passed, the church experienced major transitions. The most significant was the shift from being a persecuted faith — the Roman government regularly tortured followers of Jesus by burning them alive or feeding them to lions — to, in just a few hundred years, the Roman Empire's official religion. Once existing on the margins of society as an outcast faith, Christianity was embraced as the central pillar of religious culture. By AD 380, people were persecuted for not being Christian. As we shall see in the lives of future saints, the institutionalization of the church presented a host of new challenges. Benefiting from a common world language and the massive expansion of Roman roadways and shipping lanes, the church grew rapidly. While it made great strides in mainland Europe, little effort was employed to reaching people outside the civilized world, such as the Celts in Ireland. Some even believed there wasn't any point in sharing the good news with such barbaric tribes, since they were presumably not civilized enough to grasp it. This way of thinking has affected the church throughout its history, even up to the present. For instance, many still believe that other cultures must adopt particular styles of dress and language to be Christian. Have you ever seen pictures of native African pastors wearing polyester suits in rural villages? Change took place in the 5th century by way of a young Briton with an interesting past. In time, history would remember this man as the first missionary to barbarians beyond the reach of Roman law. The step he took was in its way as bold as Columbus's, and 1,000 times more humane. Patrick's early life. Born in the late 4th century, Maiwin Sukat, given the name Patrick years later at his ordination, grew up in Britain. His family was religious, his grandfather a priest. Throughout his early life, he likely memorized a catechism that afforded him a foundation in the biblical narrative. But from what we gather from historical records, Patrick and his prominent family experienced Christianity merely as an inherited social propriety, not as a passionate way of life. At some point during Patrick's unruly teenage years, Celtic pirates from Ireland invaded his town. These lawless barbarians swept up the coast, capturing the young man and others in the melee. Although his parents and others escaped, Patrick was kidnapped, smuggled onto a pirate ship, and carried off to Ireland. He was eventually sold as a slave to a chieftain and taken 200 miles inland. Cut off from everyone he had ever known, Patrick felt very alone. Celtic culture was barbaric, with little sense of organization and civility and no centralized power. Instead, warring tribes battled for dominance, functioning a bit like cattle rustlers in the American West at the turn of the 20th century. As a slave, Patrick was tasked with the responsibilities of a shepherd, which isolated him even further. For weeks at a time, he moved sheep from pasture to pasture, his only company his woolly friends. In his brief memoir, later published as The Confession of St. Patrick, Patrick said the afflictions most overwhelming during this time were the freezing cold and the pain of hunger. How did a teenager thrown into a cauldron of emotional and physical suffering handle the experience? Did he become bitter, disgruntled, or angry with God? Quite the opposite. We can imagine that the biblical narratives Patrick memorized as a child came to life in his mind and heart. As noted in his memoir, he began to pray hundreds of times a day. Through this practice, he formed a connection with God that he hadn't previously experienced. He began to sense God's Spirit in powerful ways, surrounded by creation, vast green pastures, gentle bleating sheep, the wisps of clouds that stretched across the azure sky. Patrick began to notice the splendor of the Creator. He wrote, "The Lord opened up my awareness of my lack of faith. Even though it came about late, I recognized my failings. So I turned with all my heart to the Lord my God, and he looked down on my lowliness and had mercy on my youthful ignorance. He guarded me before I knew him, and before I came to wisdom and could distinguish between good and evil, he protected me and consoled me as a father does for his son." In this love exchange with God, even within the confines of slavery, Patrick was learning to be content and aware of the presence of the divine. In his solitude, Patrick found hope. In his hope, he found Jesus. In Jesus, he found a love that longed to be known. Whether or not Patrick realized it, God was fashioning a certain rite of passage for him. The apathy of his early adolescence was transformed into awe and wonder for his heavenly Father. Awe is an intuition for the dignity of all things. Abraham Joshua Heschel. 6 years after his capture, Patrick was awakened from a deep sleep in the middle of the night. He heard the voice of God say, "Soon you will depart for your home country. Behold, your ship is ready." The next morning, Patrick fled. As a runaway slave, he navigated his way unnoticed 200 miles back to the sea. Arriving near an inlet, he trekked up and over the rise, and sure enough, a ship lay at anchor. The international merchants of that Roman vessel initially rejected him, but Patrick eventually negotiated his way on board and sailed back to the continent. He was going home. Imagine for a moment that you are Patrick, huddled deep in the hull of a ship, surrounded by strangers. Imagine your thoughts swaying back and forth with the foam-crested waves. Certainly the hope of freedom lies in front of you, but also present is a strange kind of grief, for in your sorrow and troubles, a song was birthed in your heart. It took slavery for your soul to be rescued. Home awaits, but what kind of life will follow? The prisoner returns. Switch the role-playing for a moment. Imagine now that you're one of Patrick's parents, who has only partially grieved the loss of your kidnapped child. You have moments when, standing on the beach, looking out over the water, you cling to strands of hope that one day your son will return. But most days you live with the dull ache that tells you he's gone, and you'll never look into his eyes again. And then, a knock. You walk toward the door, wiping the work of the day on your apron. As you turn the knob and the door creaks open, a young man darkened by the sun and worn by the elements stands before you. You know in an instant. Your heart flutters, and warmth floods your cheeks. It's your son. He's alive, and he has come home. I'm not sure how Patrick's mother responded that day. Perhaps she collapsed, cried, or praised God. And his dad, I wonder if he stood paralyzed in shock, or if he reached out and gripped his son the way a drowning man grips a life preserver. I'm a parent. I know what it is to love a son. And I'm a son. I know what it is to love a parent. What a moment it must have been. From Tarzan to the arrow, our culture is full of tales of this kind of death and rebirth. Patrick's story, however, was no myth. It was real. He was alive, and much different from the boy who once played on the rocks nearby. Patrick had been forever changed. He was no longer a Romano-Briton. Though he had grown up speaking Welsh and was schooled in classic Latin, he spent many of his formative years in Ireland learning the Celtic ways and language. Radical extraction from his native culture, followed by years of isolation, made re-entering his homeland an unnerving and painful experience. It's hard to know where you belong in a culture you no longer identify with. Living in Nashville, I often minister to artists and entertainers. I've had long conversations with friends on the challenges of resuming life at home after weeks on the road. The wives of many musicians speak of their difficulty functioning like single mothers, only to have their routines interrupted when their husbands return home. Husbands share that after coming home, it sometimes takes days to reacclimate to a completely different rhythm of life. For both men and women, life is often fraught with conflict and disorientation as they navigate the nuances of time split between home and the road. If this happens to folks spending short periods of time away from home, imagine the adjustment of a slave who suddenly became free. A displaced soul attempting to adapt to a former life. The days and nights were difficult for Patrick. While dozing off one evening, Patrick had a vision. In it, he saw an Irishman, holding up countless letters, one of them titled, "The Voice of the Irish." When Patrick first saw these words, he heard the cries of the multitudes. In tears, the Irish masses begged him to come back and walk among them once more. When he awoke, Patrick was torn. He wrestled with what was clearly a call to return to the land of his former captors and carry to them the great hope of God's love. Though he no longer fit in back home in Britain, there was a reason he ran away from Ireland and its painful memories. Going back to the place of his enslavement wasn't quite what he had in mind. Furthermore, Patrick carried with him a deep sense of shame from something that happened when he was 15 years old. Some historians think Patrick may have killed someone, perhaps a maid or a servant. British society at the time was divided into a traditional social class structure. The penalty for murder below your social class was minimal and often overlooked. But while the government hadn't punished him for the crime, Patrick never forgot it. It remained a secret that weighed heavily upon him. The vision recurred many times before Patrick finally responded to God. He said, in effect, "If this is from you, Lord, I am willing to go." Recognizing the need for ecclesiastical training, Patrick, it is surmised, moved to southern France, where he may have spent several years in a monastery learning spiritual practices and the ways of communal living. Some historians suggest that he later received formal theological training at a university in Auxerre. After Patrick had spent almost 2 decades acquiring the emotional and spiritual strength needed to return to Ireland, his superiors believed he was ready for a mission there and made preparations for his ordination to the priesthood.